Science is all about pushing boundaries, but sometimes those boundaries push back, hard. Throughout history, some of the most ambitious experiments have ended in absolute disaster, and not because the researchers lacked brains, but because they seriously underestimated Murphy's Law. We're not talking about harmless lab mistakes or a whoops, spilled some chemicals situation. We're talking about nightmares, projects that spiraled out of control, leaving destruction, chaos, and sometimes even casualties in their wake. From psychological breakdowns to military tests that should have never seen the light of day, here are 15 top-secret experiments that went so horribly wrong and what went wrong. And trust us, some of these will haunt you. Number 15. High-dose radiation tests on prisoners. When it comes to unethical science, this one is straight-up horrifying. In the 1960s and 70s, U.S. researchers deliberately exposed prisoners to extreme radiation just to see how much it would take to render them sterile. The reasoning? To test whether astronauts and atomic workers could handle radiation exposure. And since prisoners were seen as expendable, they became human test subjects. Inmates in Washington and Oregon were paid just $5 a month, with a $100 bonus if they agreed to a forced vasectomy, while their testicles were blasted with 400 rads of radiation, the equivalent of 2,400 chest X-rays. They were never informed of the real risks. Many suffered severe burns, lifelong health issues, and permanent sterility. Years later, the U.S. government admitted wrongdoing, but justice came far too late. The experiment was inhumane, reckless, and a brutal reminder of what happens when scientists treat human lives like disposable lab rats. Number 14. The drug trial that turned into a horror show. Signing up for a drug trial seems like easy money until your body starts shutting down minutes after the injection. That's exactly what happened in 2006 when 6 healthy young men in London volunteered for a clinical trial. Instead of making history, they nearly became it. The drug, TGN-1412, was supposed to help treat autoimmune diseases and leukemia. But within minutes of receiving their doses, all hell broke loose. First, nausea. Then, excruciating pain, violent chills, and swelling so extreme their heads ballooned beyond recognition. The media later dubbed it the Elephant Man trial. All 6 ended up in intensive care, hooked up to machines to keep them alive. Organs failed, blood clotted. One man lost his fingers and toes, others suffered permanent immune damage. The worst part? The drug had already been tested on monkeys, with 0 issues. Turns out even science sometimes has no idea what it's doing. Number 13. Stubbins, Firth, and the yellow fever experiment. Some scientists conduct controlled, logical experiments. Stubbins, Firth was not one of them. In the 19th century, this ambitious medical student had a theory. Yellow fever wasn't contagious. His method of proving it? The most disgusting science experiment in history. Firth smeared infected vomit into open wounds on his arm. He rubbed it into his eyes, inhaled its fumes, and, because that wasn't extreme enough, drank it. When that didn't make him sick, he injected himself with infected fluids and even built a vomit sauna, where he sat and inhaled boiling bile. Despite his stomach-churning efforts, he never got sick. He confidently concluded yellow fever wasn't contagious, totally missing the real culprit: mosquitoes. So, after all that puke consumption, what did he prove? Absolutely nothing. Some experiments are good. This one was just gross. Number 12. The Challenger disaster. On January 28, 1986, millions of people watched in excitement as NASA's Challenger shuttle launched into space, carrying teacher Krista McAuliffe, the first civilian astronaut. Just 73 seconds later, excitement turned to horror. The shuttle exploded mid-air, killing all 7 crew members. The cause? A faulty O-ring seal in one of the solid rocket boosters something NASA engineers had repeatedly warned about, but their concerns were ignored. NASA, under pressure to meet deadlines, launched anyway, despite knowing the freezing weather that morning could cause the O-ring to fail. It did, and the world watched in shock as the fireball played out on live television. The disaster was a brutal wake-up call about the dangers of cutting corners. NASA didn't launch another shuttle for 2 years, scrambling to fix their mistakes. But for the families of the astronauts, no amount of investigation or reform could bring their loved ones back. Number 11. The Milgram Shock Experiment. Would you torture someone if an authority figure told you to? Turns out most people would. That's what psychologist Stanley Milgram set out to prove in 1963, and the results are terrifying. Volunteers were told they were part of a memory study. Their job? Administer electric shocks to a learner every time they get an answer wrong. The catch? The shocks weren't real, but the volunteers didn't know that. As the experiment progressed, the learner, actually an actor, screamed in pain, begged for mercy, and even fell silent, making it seem like they had passed out. But when the scientist in charge said, "The experiment must continue," most participants kept going. A chilling 65% of people obeyed orders all the way up to 450 volts, enough to kill someone. Milgram's experiment revealed a disturbing truth. Ordinary people will commit horrific acts if told to by an authority figure. The echoes of this experiment can be found throughout history, and that's what makes it terrifying. Number 10. The Hurricane Seeding Experiment. In 1947, scientists thought they could control hurricanes. The plan? Fly a bomber into a storm and dump dry ice into its core, hoping to weaken it. Because, what could possibly go wrong? The experiment, dubbed Project Cirrus, was led by General Electric Labs. When Hurricane King formed off the Florida coast, they saw their chance. A fleet of bombers flew into the storm, releasing tons of dry ice. At first, it looked like they had succeeded. The storm vanished. But then, it came back with a vengeance. The next day, the hurricane suddenly changed direction, slamming into Savannah, Georgia, causing $2 million in damage and killing one person. The public was furious, blaming the scientists for making it worse. Lawsuits were filed, but meteorologists later argued the storm had already shifted before the experiment. Regardless, the project was quietly abandoned. If there's one lesson here, it's this: don't mess with Mother Nature. Number 9. The Monster Study. Being an orphan during the Great Depression was already a rough fate. But for 22 kids in Iowa, things got even worse when a researcher decided to use them as human test subjects in one of the most unethical studies in history. In 1939, speech therapist Mary Tudor Jacobs wanted to prove that stuttering wasn't genetic. It was a learned behavior. So she split orphans into 2 groups. One received positive reinforcement, praise, encouragement, and support. The other, they were relentlessly criticized, belittled, and told they would never speak properly. The results? Heartbreaking. Children who had never stuttered before developed severe speech disorders. Some became so anxious they barely spoke again. The trauma lasted for years, if not forever. The study was buried, and Jacobs later admitted she regretted it, but that didn't erase the damage. Science is supposed to help people. This was just 100% pure cruelty. Number 8. Unit 731. Some experiments are unethical. This one was pure evil. During World War II, Japan's Unit 731 carried out some of the most horrific human experiments ever recorded, all in the name of biological warfare. Thousands of Chinese prisoners were vivisected without anesthesia, had limbs amputated and reattached in bizarre ways, and were deliberately infected with deadly diseases like cholera, typhus, and the plague, just to see how fast they'd die. It was a real-life horror lab, and the worst part? No one was ever punished. After the war, the U.S. granted immunity to Unit 731 scientists in exchange for their research data, sweeping their crimes under the rug. Many of these so-called scientists went on to have successful careers in medicine and business, never facing justice. Unit 731 isn't just a dark stain on history, it's a terrifying reminder of what happens when science loses all morality. Number 7. The monkey gland transplant. Imagine it's the 1920s, and the world's wealthiest men are lining up for a miracle procedure promising eternal youth. The secret? Monkey testicles. Yes, this bizarre experiment was the brainchild of Sergei Abramovich Voronov, a doctor convinced that grafting monkey glands onto humans would reverse aging and enhance vitality. Rich and powerful men flocked to him, hoping to stay young forever. By the 1930s, over 500 men had undergone the surgery, including politicians, royalty, and even scientists who should have known better. Well, it didn't work. While some patients claimed to feel rejuvenated, many suffered severe infections, organ rejection, and psychological distress. Worse, Voronov's pseudoscience inspired other Frankenstein-like experiments in the years to come. Today, his work is laughed at as a cautionary tale of scientific overreach. But at the time, people genuinely believed he had cracked the code to immortality. Turns out, the only thing he proved was how desperate humans are to avoid aging. Number 6. The man who gave Thomas Edison X-ray vision. X-rays revolutionized medicine, but their discovery came at a horrific cost: one man's life. Meet Clarence Daly, a dedicated assistant to Thomas Edison in the 1890s. He was one of the first people in history to be repeatedly exposed to high doses of radiation. His job? Holding his bare hands under X-ray machines for hours, day after day, to help Edison perfect the technology. At first, no one knew radiation was dangerous. But then, Daly's hands started developing sores. His skin blackened, his hair fell out, and soon, his fingers began to rot. Amputation after amputation followed. First his fingers, then his entire left arm, then his right arm. But the damage was too deep, and at just 39 years old, he died from radiation poisoning. The tragedy shook Edison to his core. He later admitted, "Don't talk to me about X-rays. I'm afraid of them." Too little, too late, but at least he finally got the message. Number 5. The baby chimp experiment. In 1931, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg had a bizarre idea. What if you raised a chimp like a human baby? Would it act, think, and even speak like us? Naturally, he brought home a baby chimp, Gua, to raise alongside his own infant son, Donald. At first, Gua kept up, mimicking human behavior and even outperforming Donald in cognitive tasks. But then, things took a turn. Instead of Gua acting more human, Donald started acting more like a chimp, grunting, biting, and copying Gua's animalistic behaviors. Alarmed, Kellogg abruptly ended the experiment, sending Gua away. But the damage was done. Donald, who had spent critical developmental years with a chimp sibling, exhibited strange behaviors that lingered for years. The study was supposed to explore nature versus nurture. Instead, it proved something far more unsettling. Raise a human like an animal, and they'll act like one. All right, guys, now let's move to number 4, the world's first see-through frog. If you thought glow-in-the-dark fish were weird, get ready for see-through frogs. In a quest to study organ function without dissection, scientists at Hiroshima University engineered frogs with completely transparent skin. The idea? Watch their hearts beat, lungs expand, and organs function in real time. Sounds futuristic, right? Well, not if you're the frog. Instead of hopping happily in a pond, these see-through creatures were poked, prodded, and injected with experimental chemicals. While the research aimed to advance cancer studies, it also raised serious ethical questions. The frogs still endured painful tests, genetic mutations, and drug exposure. They just got the added bonus of being fully aware of everything happening to them. Animal testing has always been controversial, and while this was a step toward more humane research, these poor frogs still ended up in a living nightmare. If frogs had lawyers, you can bet they'd be suing. Number 3. The Guatemala syphilis experiment. Imagine trusting doctors only to realize they were the ones who infected you. That's exactly what happened in the 1940s when U.S. researchers deliberately infected more than 5,500 Guatemalans with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other STIs without their consent. Why? To test whether penicillin could cure sexually transmitted diseases in soldiers. Victims included prisoners, mental patients, and even children. Many were left untreated, suffering agonizing symptoms, lifelong complications, and even death. This horrifying experiment stayed buried for decades until 2010, when the U.S. government finally admitted to it. President Obama even issued a formal apology, but no amount of words could undo the damage. This wasn't medicine. This wasn't research. This was pure exploitation, one of the darkest moments in American medical history. Number 2. The gender experiment. Science should never play God, but apparently no one told psychologist John Money. His twisted gender experiment on a baby named Bruce Reimer is one of the darkest chapters in medical history. In 1965, Bruce suffered a botched circumcision that left him permanently damaged. Enter John Money, who saw this tragedy as the perfect chance to prove his radical theory, that gender identity is entirely a social construct. His solution? Raise Bruce as a girl. He pushed for a full surgical reassignment, renamed him Brenda, and forced him into therapy sessions designed to reinforce this new identity. But biology isn't that easy to rewrite. Brenda never identified as female and battled severe depression and distress. At 14, Bruce learned the truth and transitioned back to male, renaming himself David. But the psychological scars ran deep. In 2004, at just 38, he took his own life. John Money called it a success. The rest of the world called it what it was, a horrific tragedy. Number 1. The LSD elephant experiment. No, this isn't the name of an underground punk band. It's the real story of scientists who thought the best way to study elephant mating behavior was to get one absolutely high on LSD. In the 1960s, researchers were trying to understand must, a period of aggression in male elephants. Instead of observing like sane scientists, they decided to force must by injecting an elephant with acid. Their unfortunate test subject? Tusco, a 14-year-old Indian elephant. And they didn't just dose him, they overdosed him. Scientists injected Tusco with 25 times the known human hallucinogenic limit. The result? Immediate seizures. Panicked, the researchers pumped him full of barbiturates, one of which is used in lethal injections. Tusco didn't stand a chance. Some experiments push boundaries. Others are just reckless stupidity in a lab coat. If you have found this video interesting, please like and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.